Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guests that we have here. There will be our panelists for the show. First, we have Mr. Rashawn Baker, who's the president and CEO of Baker Strategy Group and the University of Maryland professor of public policy. We also have with us Mr. Andre Wong, who's the general counsel and director of public affairs and religious liberty for the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership, an organization dedicated to protecting religious freedom for Americans of all faiths. And we also have Mr. Lawrence Brown, who's the senior pastor of the Queensboro Seventh-day Adventist Church in New York City. Gentlemen, thanks for having you here with us and looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, there's an interesting topic that I wanted to talk about, one that's entitled what I would call National School Choice Week. You know, at the beginning of 2024, in that third week, January 21 to 27, school choice is going to be a process that's going to allow every family to choose what kind of K through 12 educational options that may be best for their children. This has turned into a little bit of a snafu or a little bit of a going back and forth because some people are wondering, should we be using tax dollars to allow them to be used for individuals to pay for their children going to parochial schools, charter schools, magnet schools, online private institutions, or even home learning environments. And that's why this School Choice Week seems to be so important to parents. But the real question is, are we finding that we are seeing individuals maybe going too far with this concept? Should we be pulling back? Should the thought be, well, you need to go to public schools, and if that doesn't work for you, you should be responsible for your own programming or your own financing from that perspective? You know, gentlemen, I want to talk to you a little bit about this issue. And Andre, tell me a little bit about how things have been working from your perspective as you see this topic and how it should be handled.
You know, the paramount argument for vouchers and choice is choice to allow parents to choose their child's education, and ostensibly the system improves education in general, and by making public schools compete with private schools for students in the free market, and school vouchers allow school districts to overcome racial and other segregations. That's the argument. But on the flip side, aside from the use of public funds indirectly funding private tuition, voucher opponents assert, I think, some valid policy-based points. First, there are already other choice options available for families, such as charter schools, inter-district and intra-district enrollment. And second, what they point out to is that academic outcomes in private schools are really only slightly better than public schools. But then also private schools are not as equipped to address the needs of at-risk students. You know, and I think part of that, for the most part, is true, that private schools often don't have the resources and personnel to deal with special needs and at-risk situations. So while school choice is paramount, there are areas in the academic experience where public schools are more equipped to support students.
You know, Tim Schultz, what is your thought on this? It seems like you represent a lot of organizations that have parochial schools that are attached to them. I guess the real question is, does it give anyone an unfair advantage? Or does it put somebody in a situation where now we're actually pulling away from public school education? And if investments are going other places from tax dollars, doesn't that hurt our public schools in the long run?
So just quick points, and I think that Andre made some really good ones that are sort of high-minded policy arguments. I think the brute facts of school choices, the teachers' unions, which are very powerful and influential lobbying constituency, really dislike school choice or voucher programs. And so they're defeated democratically in most parts of the country, even in more conservative states where this sort of idea is more popular. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the Supreme Court has ruled, I think correctly, that if you're going to have a school choice program, you can't discriminate against religious schools in who gets those school choice vouchers. They're right about that, I think. So that's important. And then the last thing is, I would just say that one of the things giving ammunition to the school choice movement is the differential between how public schools handled the COVID pandemic and how private schools did. Many, especially, I know hindsight is 2020, but many public schools stayed completely shuttered for a lot longer than private schools in the same jurisdictions did. And I think that has led to a lot of fuel to the fire of people wanting to get out of public schools because they're angry about the performance of public schools during that period of the pandemic when some schools were open and some weren't, but the ones that weren't were typically the public schools.
You know, Rashawn, I got to ask you a question on this as a former county executive who actually stepped in and decided that, you know what, I want the county government to kind of take over that public school system with the idea of hoping to make it better. When you see these voucher and tax credit programs, does that push back against an individual that may be trying to figure out how do I get my programs better if I'm not always getting the best students there? Maybe the data that I'm getting is skewed because of that. I mean, what's your thought regarding that?
No, I think you made some very valid points, and I think Tim and Andre made some really good points that I struggle with as an executive of the second largest school district in the state of Maryland, but also as a legislator who had to deal with these issues. The first thing that always comes up is about money. If we're doing school choice and taking money from the public school to do these choice, then that leaves the public school underfunded, and so that's always a give and take issue. The second one I think you brought up was about parents. Everyone wants their child to have a quality education. And so when we do these programs, and we do them in Maryland, and we have, public charter schools that I've supported in Prince George's County and throughout the state. But what we want to make sure is that those public schools, those public charter schools or choice schools are accepting every student that wants to go there. So the big argument you find between public school advocates and those in a private school or choice advocate is that whether in fact you're taking every child. The last thing I want to say real quick, and Andre brought this up, is that sometimes the public school is better to equip children who have special needs, especially those with disabilities and those things, than the private school has. They don't have the resources to do that. In New York right now, there's a big argument about those who are going to a choice school or to a private school and the resources compared to what New York City is offering children who go to the public school. So this is an argument that I think comes down to resources and the best place. The last thing I would say is that I do agree with if we're going to have choice, we can't discriminate against those, whether they're parochial schools, whether they're public charter schools. We want to make sure they're open and that every student can go there.
Lawrence, Rashawn mentioned New York, and obviously that's where you're located. I mean, the whole idea of what goes on in public and private schools in New York may be more unique there than maybe anywhere else in the country. As someone who went to school in New York and saw a lot of that activity, how does all of this juxtapose to where things were before, which makes them look like they're a whole lot about the same of where they are right now?
Well, this is a topic that really resonates with me because my dad had very strong feelings about it. And sometimes when he would talk and share why he felt that way, I understood where he was coming from. For some people, and as you pointed out, it is a big issue here in New York. For some people, the idea of using public funds to fund private education, it's just a non-starter. The thought is that it creates imbalances where you don't need imbalances. And living here in one of the largest school districts in the country, you can imagine what happens if a program that already faces many challenges adds to the list of those challenges underfunding. But there's another concern, and this is what really fueled the concern for my dad, the idea that if a private entity is accepting funds from another place, at any point along the way, does that begin to water down or to somehow remove that private entity's ability to stay true to mission and to sometimes talk about things that perhaps other people find unpopular. And even though they've taken steps to try and remove that as a stumbling block, you can still see why at some point people might be concerned about it. But at the end of the day, the education of our children is a vitally important thing. And as somebody who strongly supports Christian education, I believe that if that's going to be a priority for you, then you demonstrate it as a priority by how you set up your funds. That's what my parents did. Mm-hmm. We didn't get vouchers, but I had parents who decided that it was important enough for me to get a Christian education that whatever sacrifice they had to make, they made it. And all of my siblings were able to graduate from Christian education, and I feel we're the better for it. But this is one of those topics you're either very for it or very against it. I've not found too many middle of the road people here.
But Andre, let me ask you this question, though. When you take a look at this whole voucher and tax credits, does it allow some of those private institutions, and in particular parochial institutions, to kind of take the cream of the crop? Or are they in a situation where they are mandated to take any student that comes as a result of these programs? Because I could see that being problematic on both sides.
Right. Yeah, and that is a one of the issues or arguments in the debate. And and Tim brought up a point that we're actually seeing in our schools now. That I have a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old in our private schools. And during COVID, we actually saw a swell in enrollment in our schools, and it just wasn't because of the response to the regulations and the mandates, but also we have families going to private schools for the environment, for the culture, for the experience, and not necessarily the religious experience, but just something that is different from the public school environment. And we are now seeing that, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, in our private Christian schools, in our urban areas, we have more I would say non-Seventh-day Adventist member families in our schools than we do Seventh-day Adventist member students in our schools. So probably by a percentage of maybe 55 to 60% non-Adventist students in our schools.
You know, Tim, that kind of begs the question, do we really have an environment here where it is really evenly set out to protect the public schools as opposed to parochial or charter schools? It seems as though it's a great idea to allow parents to have the choice to do what they think makes the most sense. But how do we end up taking care of these larger institutions that have to be there for those who maybe won't have the opportunity to go to a private school? How do we find that balance?
I mean, it's tricky, and I think this is part of the reason why these programs are very hard when they're in front of legislators. They don't pass very often because, as Rusher and already talked about, if you're taking money out of public schools, then what you feel like is that you're sort of robbing, Peter to pay Paul, and people don't like that very much. People don't like their own public schools to be underfunded. And so that runs into democratic reality. And I think unless you can sort of find a way for everybody to win, it's going to be hard to see these programs get very far in a democratic society.
Well, I think the way we have these things that are happening right now, the idea that parents are looking to get a little bit more involved in what's going on in the classroom, what the curriculum is, who are the teachers, what are they quote unquote teaching, is probably going to cause this issue to be something that we're going to be talking about for quite some time. But the idea looks like it's going to be around forever, but we do have to find the appropriate balance to ensure that we're putting these things in the right direction. There's another case that's been something that I would call almost like the first step in what many of the recent Supreme Court decisions have been as it relates to the idea of someone being able to have their Sabbath off or their day of worship off because it's something that they believe is a priority as opposed to being forced to go to work. There was a case that's called Patterson versus Walgreens, where you had Darrell Patterson, who was a Seventh-day Adventist, longtime dedicated employee of Walgreens, had a long-standing agreement with his supervisor that because he was a Seventh-day Adventist and wanted to have this day of worship off, that he would be given that as long as he could find other people to work his shifts and things of that nature. But then Walgreens executives decided that they were going to schedule an emergency weekend training after all of this activity that may have taken place in a particular pharmacy law. And as a result, Patterson had to pay the price and was told that you either come to work or you get fired. We saw a couple of court cases at two different levels that actually ruled in favor of Walgreens. And the idea of where exactly we are going with this idea of what's going on in the area of people being protected and making sure that they can do the types of things they'd like to do in terms of protection of their faith, which America says is a big part of simply being America, seems to be something that's constantly going to be in a state of flux. You know, Andre, can you talk a little bit about this case with the Walgreens situation? And it seems as though what I'm seeing is there are more issues, not from an institutional standpoint, but a new employee comes in, a new supervisor comes in, and they act like they don't even understand the law anymore. Am I missing something here? Or tell me what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that those of us that work in the area of employment, religious accommodation are seeing this everywhere, where people are just not aware of the law. And the really aggravating circumstance here in the Patterson case is in 2011, when Mr. Patterson's supervisor scheduled him for work on a Saturday for this emergency training session. It was in response to a mistake that Walgreens management made in error of Alabama's pharmacy laws. And so it was this 2-hour, very brief emergency mandatory training that could have been done on a Friday, Saturday, or a Monday. But Walgreens schedules Mr. Patterson on a Saturday. And so, of course, because of his Sabbath, Mr. Patterson follows the appropriate process, finds a coworker to trade with him, couldn't find a switch. And Mr. Patterson, by the way, still completed the training on Monday ahead of the deadline that Walgreens set, but still he's terminated. And so here we have Walgreens, the second largest pharmacy store chain in the United States, behind CVS, by the way, scheduling a mandatory employee training because of a mistake made by Walgreens executives, forcing him really to provide for his between a choice between providing for his family and practicing a central tenet of his faith, his Sabbath observance. And the background is, although the Supreme Court has declined to take this case, this issue now is before the court from last month's Groff and DeJoy case.
Well, you know, Lawrence, I got to ask you this. You know, the law seems to be pretty clear, but it seems like we're always finding ourselves fighting the same situations, even though the law appears to be clear, because it seems as though employers decide that they're going to, I would say, roll the dice and see if somebody will bring up the law. And people are so concerned about keeping their jobs or losing their jobs, you can almost understand why they're buckling under pressure. How are we going to be able to help people to understand better what their real rights are?
Well, first of all, I think you're giving employers too much credit, because I think that many of them do not have sitting at the front of their brain the reality that this principle exists and decide they're going to test it. I think what happens essentially is that these are areas that people don't think about, and all they know is, I'm in charge, I made a declaration, you didn't follow it, I'm the sheriff around here, so guess what? You got to go. It essentially becomes a thing where pride and, you know, I'm the boss comes into play, and people end up paying a terrible price. And this is why our work will never, ever, ever be unnecessary or invalidated, because I don't care how many laws you pass. I don't care how many liberty campaigns you run. The reality is people suffer from short-term memory. And I know of people who've had accommodation for years. And even as in this case, all you need is some slight shift of the landscape. A supervisor retires and a new one comes in, or a job does something stupid, and now they have to clean it up. And all of a sudden, others are paying the price for their lack of, paying attention. And I can't say enough that in moments like these, the burden needs to be on the employer to see if there is a way to make accommodation work. Think about what just happened. One of your most dedicated employees was terminated because of something silly that you did. Now, in what universe does that make any sense?
Yeah.
We need to ever be vigilant. because these are principles that matter and they make a difference in people's lives. And like the DOG website used to say, you should not be forced to choose between faithfulness to God and earning a living. We've got to pay attention in matters like these.
Tim Schultz, are we not doing a good job of getting enough information out to what I would call the corporate population or the business community to let them know what's going on? It seems as though whenever these issues come up, we seem to be more reactive, but I'm not sure. Maybe we're not doing enough public service announcements, reminders, or am I missing something here? Or is it just simply at the end of the day, it's about dollars and cents, and employers just kind of sometimes will focus more on the dollars and a lot less on the cents?
No, I think that there's something to the idea that we need to have employers educated about why it's so important to accommodate religion and that they should do so voluntarily, notwithstanding what the law requires. I do think that it's important to realize that in this case, part of the reason that Mr. Patterson sort of lost at every level is because the law hasn't been very favorable toward employees since a very bad decision by the Supreme Court in 1977 called TWA versus Hardison. We've talked about that case on this show before. Unfortunately, that was a case interpreting federal civil rights statutes around religious accommodation. And what the court said, and part of the argument that Andre talked about in the recently argued Groff versus DeJoy case, which essentially is the same sort of a fact pattern, is the question of what do you do when the court has been misinterpreting a statute for almost 50 years, right? Because people have come to rely, for better or for worse, on a particular interpretation of that statute. Congress has had opportunities to amend the statute to make it clear that it's more pro-employee. They have not done so. Now, I think in the end, we're going to win, and that cases like Patterson's in the future will come out a different way because I think the court is going to clarify what that statute means. But part of the problem really goes back to the original sin of that TWA versus Hardison case and the court, a very pro-business court, essentially interpreting this as being, well, whatever is an inconvenience to the employer can do whatever the heck they want. And I think that was really, before anything else, that was kind of what went wrong in this case.
But Rashawn, I got to ask you this. You're a former county executive. In other words, you're looking for that strong tax base. But you're also from a jurisdiction that probably has more churches per square mile than anywhere else in the United States. How do you end up finding the right balance by making sure that you're bringing in the type of businesses that have the tax base to support all the resources that a jurisdiction needs, but also ensuring that there is the proper balance that in a community where faith is so important that they get a chance to actually serve the God the way they see fit, but nevertheless making sure that we're not looking at this as being anti-business in any way?
Exactly. I think you do it the way that both Lawrence has talked about and the way Tim has talked about it. You have these conversations up front with businesses. I know that's what we did when I was county executive. And it seems like in this case, Walgreens actually got it right in the beginning. And then you had a new manager come in and just totally dismiss the practice that had been in place. Because one of the things that we try to make it very important to businesses is that you want to keep good employees. Faith and community is very important. It goes to the whole fabric of being a good business partner. You don't want to have businesses, who can't operate because all their employees can't work on a certain day. But you certainly want to accommodate every diverse faith that we have here to make those folks want to stay and work in this company and make it work in the jurisdiction. I think in this case, the new manager at Walgreens came in and treated this private entity as if it was the military. The military is the only place where you lose all your constitutional rights, or most of them. In this case, you found an employee a supervisor who did that. And I think it's unfortunate. And I think we should either at the legislative level, at the federal level, or at the court level, straighten these type of things out. This is when you get conflicts between religion and the private sector and businesses, when we shouldn't have those conflicts. I think this is one where they made a grave mistake.
But Andre, let me ask you this. We're seeing these cases come up before the court again. And now the question is, if I've got a couple hundred Americans or a couple 100 million Americans who decide that they want to take a day off because that's their day of worship, and now you start thinking about the economic impact that may be, quote unquote, causing a ripple effect across the country, how do we handle that situation? Because on one hand, people want to have their faith protected, but on the other hand, I would say that a lot more people are more concerned with what I would call, am I getting the best bang for the buck? Am I getting as much as I want out of my employees? But how do we juxtapose those two?
Yeah, so if you listen to the oral arguments of the Groff case, that was really one of the main considerations. Because they're talking about, okay, well, the term de minimis effect, from the Hardison standard, and it's interesting. Mr. Patterson sued Walgreens for his religious workplace discrimination, and both the trial court and court of appeals sided with Walgreens, holding that Walgreens had done enough to accommodate Mr. Patterson's religious beliefs. And then in 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court denied cert on that case, but then took up Groff, and so it'll be interesting to see how they address that very question of what will be the impact not only to a company but also to the U.S. economy.
I think Tim hit it really on the head with Hardison. The struggle, it sounds like everyone's having, is being able to understand what is the definition of undue hardship. When you start putting those type of terms in place, now you start to allow organizations and individuals to conclude what the definition should be. What would be ideal if in some form or fashion the courts could come back, give us a succinct definition of what undue hardship is, and I think that's probably going to get us in a much better position than where we are right now. But I have to let that be the last word on this, guys. Hey, Rashawn, tell me something I don't know.
Well, we were congratulating you off camera about your daughter getting her PhD at Harvard. Did you know that the third African-American to get their PhD in history from Harvard was John Hope Franklin?
Didn't know that. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
There are 9,560 Walgreens stores in the United States. That is so many that 78% of the population in the United States lives within 5 miles of a Walgreens.
Wow. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Rashawn and I both live in the Washington, D.C. area, and there is rejoicing in this area as the sale of the Washington football team, the Washington Commanders, has happened, taking Daniel Snyder off of everybody's hands.
Wow. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
And on that note, you may not know it, but you will find out that Aaron Rodgers looks as good in Jets green as he does in Green Bay green.
Gentlemen, I'll have to let that be the last word. Thanks so much for being here with us. Really appreciate all the information that you've given us and for our audience today. Thanks again for being with us on Faith and Politics. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.